Hey, well, good morning. My name is Mike Hartke, and I'm here because our pastors, as you found out, have been away for the last several days enjoying the sun and fun in Traverse City at annual conference. So will you please pray with me? Gracious and good God, we offer our praise and worship to you this morning as we trust in your promise of being amongst us as we gather in your holy and blessed name. Open our hearts and our minds to your calling as we worship you, allowing the Holy Spirit into our hearts. Thank you for this time together to worship you and to fellowship as believers. Well, today's message is 70 times 7, and it's part of our series entitled Forgiveness. So 70 times 7 is from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 18, verses 21 through 22. Please follow along. Then Peter came to him and asked, "Lord, how often should I forgive someone who sins against me? 7 times? No, not 7 times, Jesus replied, but 70 times 7. I think it's interesting in this passage that Peter chooses 7 as the number. 7 is a perfect number in Jewish history, and it's the number of the Bible. But yet, ironically, at this particular time in history, the rabbinical priest would have said, no, 3 times is plenty. So Peter is being overly generous with his number of 7, but at the same time, Jesus says 7 times 70. So the question is, well, 7 times 70 is 490. So is that all you have to do? I mean, when you get to 491, is it over? You don't have to forgive anymore? Are you off the hook? Can you quit? No. Probably not. Jesus was using a ridiculous number. He was using an extended number that would have not been taken literally, but would have been taken figuratively. It means a very large number. So what Jesus is saying to us metaphorically is this: never stop forgiving. Now, I think we all know that's a whole lot easier said than done. And in a lot of cases, there are those small slights, the little things that really aren't a big bother. They're pretty easy to forgive in a lot of cases. Then there are those not so little slights that are maybe a little bit harder to forgive. And then there are those really, really big ones, the ones that are just too big and too hurtful to turn away from. And you have to ask yourself, what can I do to forgive and let go of my hurt and forgive that other person? So I'm going to take a look at all 3 of these this morning, in each one of those scenarios, and unpack each one as we go along. So let's start with the small ones. So many things fall into that small category. For me, and I think maybe some of you, driving can be sort of a frustrating experience. I have to tell you, I've been tempted to not lash out at folks. I'm trying to do that better. The ones that don't drive as good as I do, which in my experience is pretty much everybody. So I have, in the past, I've been pretty uncomplimentary to those folks. And a lot of condemnation. My wife's helping me get better at that. But I found a little thing that's been helping me recently, and that is I think about my mother. And let me explain. For years, my mother wouldn't drive a car. Her reason was a small slight that had happened years earlier. She worked at a grocery store, and I don't know if my parents owned it or if it was just a small grocery store, but she was in the process of backing a truck up to load some pop bottles, the old glass pop bottles, the ones that they used to wash and refill. And so she's backing up, and she hit some of them, and she got laughed at. Well, that one incident was enough for her to never want to drive again. She vowed she wouldn't, and she didn't. In her mid-60s, she started again, though. And she started because my brother literally bought her a car and forced her to learn how to drive. So her inability to forgive those people who had made fun of her cost her most of a lifetime of being able to drive, and caused a little bit of problems within the family, too, because we had to get around as well. My point here is that as she learned to drive as a mature adult, shall we say, she probably wasn't the most confident driver on the road. So when I run into one of those drivers that I think is not doing a very good job, I think about my mother. And I picture her as the offending driver. And in that case, I find it a whole lot easier to forgive that person. You know, one of the suggestions that Adam Hamilton makes in his book Forgiveness is to use this little catchphrase, RAP, RAP. Remember your own shortcomings, assume the best in people, and probably most importantly, pray for them. Now, I recognize forgiveness is a whole lot easier said than done. You know, for the small things, it's probably pretty easy. Some things are so small that you probably don't even use the term forgive. You probably just say, I overlooked it or I ignored it. But some things aren't that simple. They're just bigger than a small annoyance, and they're probably a little harder to brush off. So what happens when we have to forgive someone something that isn't quite as small as an annoyance? You know, one of the things that comes to my mind was, in retrospect, really a pretty minor thing, but it kind of seemed pretty big at the time to me. My daughter was in high school, and she had a curfew of midnight. Well, she was usually pretty good at it. In fact, she was almost always pretty good at it. Now, remember, we are talking here about pre-cell phone days. And maybe some of you remember those, but it was a whole different place then. So I worried. When she was late, I was always concerned. We talked about it a couple of times, but midnight slowly but surely became more of like a suggested time rather than a firm rule. Well, at that time for me, midnight was kind of locked in. I mean, that's it. It's midnight. I worried about her. It was tough for me to go to bed until she got home. And I was usually up wandering around the house trying to find something to do until she rolled in. So one night she showed up a little late. Now, I'm not talking hours late. I'm talking maybe 30 minutes. It wasn't egregious. I said, you know what? I can't do this anymore. You're grounded. Well, that turned into a pretty lengthy discussion, several hours of tears and angst, a lot of anxiety. And honestly, for me, it wasn't so much about her being late as about the fact that I was worried about her. And here's where this gets just a little tricky. She's a young high school student, and I had to forgive her for bending the rules a little bit, and probably more importantly for making me worry. So by forgiving her, I allowed myself the ability to forget the incident and not dwell on it. So here's where the problem starts to come in. Is forgiving the same as condoning? Well, I didn't condone her behavior. I did forgive her behavior. The fact that she was late, which she had been on several occasions, I forgave. Probably not 7 times 70, but a few times. But the question is, does that dismiss the consequences? Well, unfortunately for her in this case, the answer was no. She was still grounded. So I related this story. I didn't give her the details of what I was going to say, but I relayed that I was going to share that story. And when I told her that, she said, well, who forgave who in that story, Dad? You see, forgiveness is a two-way street. It depends on your vantage point. And apparently, in this particular case, I needed to be forgiven as well. So for me, that was a lesson that we all should take to heart. Now, forgiving, as I said earlier, doesn't mean consequences don't apply. I mean, if somebody steals something from you, there are going to be real-world consequences that are going to be dealt out. And what about that person that doesn't ask for or want forgiveness? Do we still forgive them? Is the goal to ease the burden on them, or is it to free our hearts and allow us to move on? Well, in Matthew 18, there's a process for reconciliation within the church. It's probably a good model for all of us to think about and follow when we feel wronged by another person. Let's take a look at that scripture. This is Matthew 18, verses 15 through 17. Follow along, please. If your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault, just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you've won them over. But if they will not listen, take 1 or 2 others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church. And if they refuse to listen even to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. So the biblical process in Matthew is a 3-step process. First of all, You approach the person one-on-one and you make your case. Second, bring somebody along to speak to that person and help discern the truth in the matter. And finally, you bring it to a larger group within the circle of believers. Now, I say it that way because it's important to understand that at the time this was written, the church was a pretty small community. It was 120 people probably. And so that meant that any wrong was a pretty personal thing. It was a very one-on-one situation in this relatively small group. I mean, everybody pretty much knew everybody in that early church. Well, our church today might not quite be the same. We have bigger churches, we have more people involved. But the real takeaway is that by confirming your perception that you have been wronged, you might reveal that it is you, in fact, who are in the wrong. I mean, sometimes a fresh set of eyes on any issue reveals a whole new vantage point for a perceived wrong. And finally, Jesus said to them, treat them like a pagan or a tax collector. Well, to me at first, this sounds pretty harsh. I mean, does that mean we're to exclude them from fellowships? Until you realize it was Jesus who spent most of his time with those very pagans and tax collectors. For me, the implication is that you are to bring them into fellowship regardless of the wrong, just as Jesus did. So the biblical method for sorting out problems is a process that it can be beneficial, but only if it's done in a place of forgiveness and caring. And I would suggest that before you confront anyone, you think about it. T, is it true? When you approach that person, is it a true statement? Is it how you feel, or is it really true? And did it really happen? And even if it did, ask yourself, is this helpful? H, helpful. Does this really make a difference, and will it change anything if I move forward with it? And I, is it inspiring? In other words, does it help the other person? Or does it help you gain a better understanding of the situation? And then ask yourself, is it necessary? I mean, is this something that can't be reconciled without seeing the light of day? And then finally, is it kind? I mean, how do you approach that person? Do you approach them with humility and forgiveness? Or do you approach them with anger and reproach? Now, what about the really big things? The things that are bigger than just a small annoyance, that you might think are almost impossible to get through? What about the things that just permeate your being to a level where you just can't get past it? Well, unfortunately, I have an example that's pretty close to home. My example of how not to behave is, of all people, my grandmother. She had 3 sons, Edward, my dad, Clifford, one of my uncles, and Norman, a second uncle. At some point, my grandmother got angry at Norman, and she never did. She said she was never going to speak with him again, and she never did. Now, she lived with us as a family, so that put my dad in a pretty awkward position as well. And I, frankly, had no idea for the longest time that I had another uncle. I had no idea that I had cousins. I had no idea where they lived or who they were or anything about them until at my grandmother's funeral, a guy came up to me and he said, "Hi, my name is Mike Hartke." Well, I was a little surprised by that. I looked at him pretty strangely and I said, "Me too." And it turns out that he was a cousin from my Uncle Norman, who I had never met and knew nothing about until fairly recently. Now, it's a sad thing when, really, honestly, forgiveness can't somehow be found in the small things. They're just so unobtrusive. What was that argument about? Now, I did find out what the real exact reason was, but I asked my mother, and she said it was a relatively small slight, an unkind word in the heat of an argument, and somehow that led to a lifetime of estrangement and hurt for an entire family. See, these are the kind of small things that turn into really big things that ultimately never get resolved. Things that could so easily have been solved by just an ounce of forgiveness early on in the process. And then what about the really, really, really big things? So let me share a story about a woman named Faith Brown. She suffered what is possibly one of the most horrendous acts I've ever heard of in my entire life. This woman was married. She had 4 children with her husband, and they got into an argument, as frequently couples do. If you've been married for any length of time, you've probably had 1 or 2. Well, she didn't realize how serious it was until she came home. He came home and killed all 4 of the children and injured her severely. She lived. The children died. The really, really sad thing about this is that man had been convicted of the exact same crime earlier and had gotten out of prison recently. She wrote a book and it details this entire episode and how she's put her life back together to become a productive human being. She talks about the long road back to what she calls a new normal and building this new life without her children. She was a speaker at a First Step event that we attended a few months ago, and she told her story. And I'll tell you what, at the end of that, you could have heard a pin drop in that huge auditorium. And there probably wasn't a dry eye in the place. And finally, the person who happened to be one of the local news anchors who was emceeing the show tried on 2 occasions to get up and start to show up again, and she couldn't. She was so moved by it. So Faith has gotten through the part about putting her life back together, but I'm not certain if she can or ever will forgive such a huge loss. But what I do know is that Jesus is the way. See, in practicing forgiveness, we follow the examples that Jesus himself set. Throughout his ministry, he embodied the essence of forgiveness. From the cross, he uttered the words, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do," in the face of betrayal and cruelty and ultimately his death. You see, forgiveness in the eyes of Christ isn't a sign of weakness, but it's a sign of strength. See, it takes great courage and great humility to let go of resentment, to release the grip of anger, and to offer pardon to the person or persons that have wronged us. It's a process that requires us to confront our own pain, to heal our own wounds, and to extend compassion and love to others. See, forgiveness is the ultimate cleansing of the hurt from our soul. It's the way we can find freedom in a world that frequently steals our joy. It becomes our own very personal way to right the wrongs that we perceive around us. And how can we be preoccupied with our own personal hurts if we've given them up and have chosen to be loving and caring, even to the ones that we feel have wronged us? And how can we continue to hold on to hurt if we're earnestly praying for the person that inflicted it? See, perhaps with enough prayer, we may find that the injustice we perceive was of our own doing. Perhaps the person we need to forgive is ourselves for either being a false witness or not being honest with our feelings. And maybe even that false witness isn't even seen the light of day. Maybe it's just in our minds. So I've heard that doing something for 21 days ingrains it as a habit. Now, maybe that's what Jesus was telling us in his ultimate wisdom. Maybe he's telling us if we forgive enough, we can create a new habit of forgiveness. And along with that, a habit of overlooking the worst in people and focusing on the best in people. We can focus on the things that make them who they are and understand that perhaps we need to receive as much forgiveness as we can offer, no matter how much we try. But one of the things that I know for sure is this: lack of forgiveness can pollute your soul. It creates bitterness. It creates resentment. It creates a wall between our better selves and our resentful nature. And it can drive us away from God toward our own sinful nature. And here's the thing. The problem with sin is that it leads you where you don't want to be. It takes you deeper than you want to go, and it keeps you longer than you want to stay. And sometimes the only way out of that place of sin and remorse is forgiveness. First, forgiveness offered by you to whoever has wronged you, and perhaps more importantly, the forgiveness offered to you by God, seeing you only as a child, loved by him, and seen through the lens of his Son, Jesus Christ. Perhaps the day you can let go of that one big hurt, or maybe let go of a small one that's been front and center in your life for a while. Maybe today is the day that you start making forgiveness a habit and let it permeate your being. When you do, you might find that you're able to live in the freedom and love that only Jesus can provide. Amen?